Continuing on in our series, video blogs about how to handle conflict. And if you remember, we talked at the very beginning about how conflict begins with offense in the heart and how we can be angry at another person. We talked about how that's not an okay thing for a Christian. We don't have the right to ever be angry as we trust God's sovereignty with the hurts that come into our lives. Then we looked at the issue of righteous anger and how there is a potential for righteous anger, but it's very complex definition, and there's some litmus tests that evaluate whether or not our anger is righteous. And then last time we looked at the whole issue of how love is the way that we get through a conflict, that love covers a multitude of sins, and that's how we pass through conflict, is by covering over the sins of other people with the love that we have for them in our hearts. Well, some of you may have thought at the end of the last series there, at the end of the last video last time, the question might come up in your heart, well, does that mean that we just let people sin just at will? So people in our lives, we cover over their sin with love, and therefore no one ever gets confronted. We just sort of allow sin to take place. The answer in the scriptures is explicitly no. We don't want to let another person sin. In fact, when Paul defines love in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, he says, love does not rejoice in unrighteousness, but rejoices in the truth. And so if we really love a person and we see them sinning, even if it's sinning against us, what do we need to do? Well, the answer is we need to go and confront them, to correct them, to help them out of that sin. Now, there's a whole bunch of things that we need to talk about here. This is going to be at least a 2-part series, probably a 3-part series of videos dealing with these issues. And so what I want to do is first take us to the question of what that looks like, and that's from Galatians chapter 6, verse 1. Paul provides a very helpful, very succinct definition of confrontation in the church in that verse. And so in Galatians chapter 6, 1, Paul says this. He says, brothers, even if anyone is caught in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness, each one looking to yourself, so that you too will not be tempted. Bear one another's burdens, and thereby fulfill the law of Christ. Now, the first thing we want to look at is the issue of when to confront. Now, the apostle says, even if anyone, the word there in Greek is the word for man, anthropos, is just a person, is caught in any trespass. Now, what he describes here is relationships between believers. Another believer is caught by sin. Now, the language is very interesting. It doesn't say that person has been committing a sin flagrantly for many years. It doesn't say it's the very first time that person has sinned. In fact, it's very loose. It's not specific about who ought to be confronted and when. But what we do notice in this verb that's being used here, being overtaken or caught in a trespass, is that person now has been attacked and caught by that sin. It's some sin that they have not been able to get themselves free from. They've been unable to walk away from, to release themselves from. They're now caught in that trespass. Sin here is sort of given a life of its own as it comes and attacks the believer. And we see that all over the place. In fact, in Romans chapter 7, Paul describes sin in the flesh as something that then takes control of him and causes him to do the things that he doesn't want to do. So when Paul here is talking about one who is caught in a trespass, he's talking about someone who has been overtaken by sin, who has been attacked by it, and who now is under the control of it. And the goal of correction at this point is to restore such a one. So the goal is to bring that person back to a place of spirit-led righteousness, away from the sin that has now caught them. Now, this is incredibly important because the danger for us is to say, well, to either fall off the horse one way or the other, to either say, I saw a person sin, I'm going to go confront them right now. I want to restore them. The problem is that if they've already repented of that sin, they may have already restored themselves. They might already be back walking in the Spirit because they've already dealt with that sin. And so if we're too quick to confront, that puts us in a place of sort of being sort of holier than thou and attacking people who are sinning. The way we can fall off the horse the other way is to sort of allow sin to continue and say, well, I don't know if they're caught in the trespass or not. It's not that big of a deal. I'm not going to confront them. Either way is not healthy. And so what we need to do is walk in the Spirit and observe and care for people in such a way that we restore the ones who have been caught in a trespass, who have been caught in a sin. Now, what's important here is that the goal of this is for restoration, a restoration to spiritual life. Here in chapter 6, this verse in chapter 6 comes right after the fruits of the Spirit in chapter 5. If you just look up in chapter 5, verse 22, he says, the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such things there is no law. So he says a person who's walking in the Spirit is walking in those fruits, is producing those fruits of the Spirit. A person who now is caught in a trespass where sin has overtaken them is no longer walking in the Spirit and is therefore not producing the fruits of the Spirit and needs restoration. That person needs care from another person. So we have the when. When do we confront? Well, the answer is through the leading of the Spirit, we confront when we find that a person has been caught in a trespass and is unable to restore themselves or has not restored themselves. So we need to care for that person at that moment. And then the why. Why do we go and confront or correct another person? The answer is for the sake of restoration. That's the key critical component, that the goal of this is restoration, that we do it in a way and a means by which that person is restored back to a life of Spirit-filled, Spirit-led, joyful obedience. That's the goal of all correction in the Christian life. Now the next question that we have to ask is how? How do we confront that person? There's a host of things to talk about here. First, there's a whole practical component. We're going to talk about that from Matthew chapter 18, where Christ describes church discipline. We want to use that as a model for confrontation when we walk through the how, practically, of dealing with sin. But I want to just look quickly at the spirit that this act is taking place in. If you just look at it, it says, if anyone is caught in any trespass, you who are spiritual. What does that mean? It means those who are walking in the Spirit. So you have a brother or sister who's not walking in the Spirit because they're stumbling, sinning, they've been caught in some trespass. Paul says, listen, you who are not caught in a trespass, you who are walking in the Spirit, should restore that one. And he says that should be done in a spirit of gentleness. Now, we should expect the word gentleness here because why? Well, it's one of the fruits of the Spirit that he's already described in chapter 5, verses 22 and 23. One who is spiritual is one who is walking and producing the fruits of the Spirit. Correction always has to be done according to the Spirit. What does that mean? It means it comes from a place of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. That person who is the confronter, the corrector, needs to be walking in the Spirit in order for that confrontation to be Spirit-led and Spirit-filled. Now, this takes us back to the issue of conflict. If we come to a conflict and we want to confront, not because we love the person and because we've already forgiven them, but because we're angry at them or we're still harboring some offense in our heart, what's going to happen when we go and we speak to them about the sin issue that we want to point out in their life? Without any question, it's not going to be led by the Spirit. It will always result in conflict. The only way to correct a brother or sister is to begin from a place of genuine love and genuine Spirit-filled care for that person before we ever go and speak to them about their sin. In fact, to go and confront another brother when we still are harboring feelings of anger that are not born out of love in our hearts is to not walk in the Spirit. We're committing the exact same sin that they're committing on the other side. In fact, in many ways, we're committing a double sin because we're already not walking in the Spirit because we're not loving that person. And then in our pride, we're going and confronting a person based on the anger that we feel instead of true spiritual humility coming to that other person. And so, yes, we confront sin, but we do it in a spiritual way. Now there's lots more in this verse that we need to look at. There's a couple more very important points. We'll cover those the next time, and then we'll talk about the practical steps for confrontation. And so, instead of being offended, when we go to confront a person, when we're going to deal with conflict that's taking place and sin that's been committed, we want to care for and love that person. We must come to them in a spirit of gentleness, walking in the Spirit, born out of a love for that person and a desire to see them restored to spiritual life. Hope that's encouraging to you.